Perhaps I've just finally been confronted with one of Houellebecq's truths that, for the first time, I simply can't tolerate, which would be the fantastically disappointing nature of life itself. Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. Delicious. Colombia. Today is Annihilation by the French author Michel Houellebecq, published in 2024. This was sent to me by the publisher Farrar, Straus & Giroux by way of Sam. An enormous thank you, Sam. That was very kind of you. Thank you very much. I was introduced to Sam by way of Seth, aka Waste Mailing List on Instagram and YouTube. A man of exceptional knowledge and literary taste, so thank you very much to him as well. I've linked to both of their Instagrams below and I highly suggest you follow them. So I'm partially sponsored by Farrar, Straus & Giroux, or FSG, in that they sent me this book for free. So thank you very much to them as well. To get into what is really great about this novel, I came to the conclusion that I'll have to give spoilers. So fair warning. That said, it's a Houellebecq novel. You can pretty much guess how it's going to end, you know? So this is the latest novel from the French author Michel Houellebecq, author of such great books as The Elementary Particles, Submission, Serotonin, Platform, The Map and the Territory, The Possibility of an Island, and more. He's one of the most famous living French novelists, perhaps the most famous. Annihilation is his longest novel, and it is also, sadly, if we are to take him at his word, his last. He's had a great run up to this, gaining a reputation as something of a dismal but darkly satirical prophet, writing about cultural issues in France and Europe. In the past, Houellebecq has had a direct connection with social-political conflict, as his face was the character on the cover of Charlie Hebdo when the office of the satirical newspaper was attacked by Islamic terrorists who killed 12 people. His book Submission, which is a fictitious narrative about France's conversion to Islam, was published on the same day. At that point, Houellebecq understandably went into hiding. The attack is briefly alluded to in this novel. But he did not stop working. Many of his books possess this mild element of science fiction, but in the way that J.G. Ballard or William Gibson employ it. 5 minutes into the future, as Ballard said. That kind of thing. Such is the case with Annihilation, which is set in France in 2027. Its publication a few years ago in France was a big event. It seems to me that Houellebecq has an awe-inspiring ability to throw his readers into a profound depression by, very simply and without exaggeration, but rather in just a calm, direct manner, telling them the truth. As in, this is where you're at, this is what life is, this is what will likely happen. This is what you want, this is what you get. All his novels have a similar protagonist, the Houellebecqian archetype. A passive, disenchanted, middle-aged man experiencing the various dismal prospects of the sexual market and human relationships in modern Europe. What's noticeably different in Annihilation from Houellebecq's previous books is that this time the protagonist, Paul Raison, is married. So this time we're given a portrait of a failing marriage. Failing, though not lost. Very important. Like Houellebecq's other novels, Annihilation is a meditation on the tragedy of human relationships, the passing of time as it is lost to the mundane, routine banality of living in the modern world, and our undying hope for something transcendent in the midst of this peculiar one-way trip. His books are filled with observation and reflection, and this one is no different. The authors he seems most inspired by are J.K. Huysmans, one of my favorites, and Balzac. The characters in this book experience challenges that would take a severe toll on the mental health of any of us. Hopefully you aren't going through anything nearly as challenging as they are, but many of us are having a tough time these days, and it's crucial that we have tools to take care of our mental health. And I'm an enthusiast of anything that can potentially help. Some of my preferred tools would be eating properly, getting enough sleep, exercising, weight training, running, walking, incline walking, and another tool is therapy, which is why I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make finding therapy more affordable and accessible, which is helpful because finding the right therapist could be potentially challenging given the slim options in your area. Especially if you live somewhere rural or in a small town or you travel a lot, it could definitely be difficult to find the right therapist in person. And unlike many things these days, many things, am I right? They make finding a therapist easy. Because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions online, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist in as little as just a few days. And it's easy to get matched with a therapist. There's a link below in the description. It's betterhelp.com/BTF. Clicking on that link helps support the show, but it also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp so you can try them out and see if it works for you. And I sincerely hope it does. And because finding the right therapist is a little bit like dating, as if you needed more challenges in your life of that nature, I get it. But if you don't initially fit with your therapist, you can switch to a new therapist at any time at no additional cost without having to worry about health insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. No worries there. So if you're struggling right now, and let's face it, who isn't? Please consider online therapy with BetterHelp. And thanks again to BetterHelp for supporting this channel. Annihilation is a portrait of familial and existential drama, combined with a political thriller, set in France in 2027 around an upcoming election. France isn't doing too good. It's an era of enormous wealth disparity outside of Paris and the provinces, as well as an era of growing racial hatred. The protagonist, named Paul Raison, is a civil servant at the Ministry of Finance in Paris. He's a passive, normal guy in a high-paying career. He's married to a woman named Prudence who works for the Treasury. When we find him, their marriage has slowly eroded over the last decade. No intimacy remains, no sex, no nothing. When we first meet Paul, they're basically leading separate lives. They're childless, but as Paul, or Houellebecq reasons, if they weren't, they probably would have already separated. Paul's boss, Bruno Juge, the Minister of Finance, is supporting a candidate in the upcoming presidential election and slowly being drawn into politics. While they maintain a professional relationship, he is basically Paul's only friend. The beginning of the book describes an extremely sophisticated video uploaded by a clandestine group of terrorists, which depicts a simulated execution of Bruno by guillotine. The same group later begins carrying out increasingly large-scale attacks. Always sophisticated, perfectly coordinated, always flawless. Clearly with a great deal of funding behind them, but no clear motive or affiliation. Paul's sister Cécile and her unemployed former notary husband Hervé are devout Catholics. Cécile is very saintly. Hervé has a past connected to right-wing religious activism. Paul and Cécile's younger brother Aurélien restores medieval art for a living, and is married to an insufferable SJW journalist named Indy. The mother of Paul and his siblings was an artist who passed away after an accident, falling from the side of a church during a restoration project. Paul's retired father, Edouard, who worked for the DGSI, essentially the French equivalent of the FBI, has a stroke and is left immobile. Paul and his family assembled the seat at his care, and the novel presents a very frightening modern situation concerning the elderly are dying and the dark fate that awaits them, being sequestered and hidden away from society, forgotten, neglected, and essentially left for dead. Paul's father's partner, Madeleine, is devastated, but does her best to have as active a role possible in his care. When the hospital where Paul's father is staying has a change of command, and disallows Madeleine to be such a large part of his life, for bureaucratic reasons, they call upon Hervé's old activist connections to break him out. It's revealed that before he had his stroke, Paul learns that his father had been working on deciphering documents from this terrorist organization. Even though he was retired, he was still working on it. It proves very difficult to find out just what the terrorists are going for and who's behind it. There's some discussion on the life of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. It's eventually revealed that the terrorists have some connection, however strong or loose, with Satanism. And this is from the book. This is Paul reflecting here. The worst thing was that if the terrorists' goal was to annihilate the world as he knew it, to annihilate the modern world, he couldn't entirely blame them. And this is a guy who works for the French Ministry of Finance, so he's in the government, right? He's around it at least. Annihilation is an exploration of our inevitable decline and death as individuals, both spiritual and physical. The novel is Paul's long act of reflection on his life, what has happened, what hasn't, and what's left. Throughout the book, you'll notice a great deal of Paul's dreams and travels, which seemingly reinforce the theme of the individual's journey through time and desire to reach something, to arrive somewhere. The reality of Paul's life is rendered quietly disappointing. Not quite catastrophic, in the beginning at least, but without much vitality. He's a complacent figure, without any pull in any direction save for the bar or wherever he's located, as he drinks like a fish. He ignores his health, a toothache. Then his life turns into a catastrophe, and suddenly he finds himself dying at the same time as his father, which is just awful. I mean, you know. Always go to the dentist. Thank you. Ignore me and Houellebecq at your peril. Paul is attracted to Christianity and to his sister Cécile's faith. In some ways he finds it admirable, and even tries it out for himself a little bit, sort of. But he can't really get there. The book seems to suggest that whatever religion it may be, it's never enough to have any kind of significant effect when facing one's own mortality, and perhaps the death of loved ones as well. Aurelian's profession, the restoration of Christian art, plays into this theme of an attempt at resurrecting Christianity in the modern era, this attempt of preserving something that has been lost. And you can also kind of see that in the care for Paul's father, and also Paul and Prudence's attempt to save their marriage. Meanwhile, Paul discovers his wife's newfound interest in a kind of banal neo-paganism, Wicca, of which he discovers many of the employees at Bercy, the government building in Paris he works at, are a part of, up and down the hierarchical spectrum. And interestingly, my wife informed me that there's a surprising number of Wiccans in the American Air Force. Who'd have thunk? The resurgence of Christianity in the West is interesting, but a cynical part of me can't help but think it's a sign of trending desperation, you know? It could be a sincere search for a powerful spiritual illumination. Could be both, I suppose. But it just as well could be a fail-safe option, due to a culture, the West, collectively experiencing a realization that technology and consumerism does not facilitate more connection, nor fill the void, but instead merely deepens it, and will rapidly continue to do so. Houellebecq doesn't seem to think that it will save us, neither Christianity nor all religions. Adequately confronting our own mortality seems to be something that no religion has achieved. I'm not sure what that would even look like, and I think that's Houellebecq's whole point, not only with this book, but his entire oeuvre. The notion is, to the best of our knowledge, impossible. So with this novel, Houellebecq gives us the unfiltered truth about the trajectory of our lives. So the configuration of the world is changing right now, Paul said to himself. Generally speaking, the configuration of the world remains stable, Things continue on their course, but sometimes, rarely, an event takes place. It's much the same, he thought, more generally and more vaguely, with the configuration of human lives. Human life consists of a sequence of administrative and technical difficulties, interspersed with medical problems. As age advances, medical aspects take the upper hand. Then the nature of life changes and starts looking like a steeplechase. Increasingly frequent and varied medical examinations study the state of your organs. They conclude that the situation is normal, or acceptable at least, until one of them delivers a different verdict. Then the nature of life changes again, to become a more or less long and painful journey to death. And sadly, for all of us who are fortunate enough to live to old age, that's how it's going to play out. That's exactly what's going to happen, for all of us. Every single one. Nobody escapes it. Not me, not you, not your friends, not your loved ones, nobody. Even if you're religious, that's still exactly what's going to happen. The chances that that will not be your fate are literally zero. The only thing that might make this process slightly more bearable is money. But as Houellebecq points out, when the situation is really at its end, the point is sort of moot. The whole book has an autumnal theme, the theme of autumn, right? The soundtrack in my head throughout the whole book was Bach's cello suites, you know? It just seemed totally appropriate. That's like the ultimate fall music. And it actually ends on Halloween. Thinking about the novel for a few days after finishing, thinking about it a lot, for me, most of the book felt like a missed opportunity. My initial reaction is that it's my least favorite novel of his I've read. Houellebecq's superpower has always been his insightful, quiet, calmly delivered, humorous ferocity. And with this novel, I think he could have done better. Everybody's calling this book tender. The word appears several times in the book. It is, and that's a huge shift for him. I don't read Houellebecq for tenderness. His style of indifferent pessimism in the past was, in fact, a sort of exhilarating comedic dynamism. It's not the tenderness that ruins the book for me. Parts of it that fall under that description were very beautiful, but rather overall the lack of vitality. But then the book is called Annihilation and is in fact all about death, so perhaps I only have myself to blame here. I get it. But it's true, the book is kind of bloodless even for Houellebecq. You get a strong sense of the author's fatigue with the whole endeavor, with writing itself, perhaps with humanity and life as a whole. This feeling can produce a good novel. He's done it before, he's done it several times. But it's not easy, you know, it's an arduous endeavor. I felt irked with the book for its broad strokes that felt underdeveloped and stretched believability. He does this in all of his books, but in this one in particular, it really goes nowhere. The slovenly metalhead who discovers the Satanist terrorists are plotting attacks based on coordinates correlating to the symbol of the pentagram when they overlay it over Europe and they can see where they're going to hit next. The clandestine activists who rescue the elderly, the head of which is a mouthpiece for Houellebecq's opinions, and I don't disagree with them, but the implementation felt awkward, clunky, rushed. Either of these could have been interesting, but they felt underdeveloped, intentionally it seems. It was as though the novel set out to be realism, but when that appeared to be too banal to read, or perhaps just too depressing, these elements were thrown in to spice it up. But it just seemed kind of tacked on, you know? Whereas with the possibility of an island, he really committed to it. And the incorporation of the futuristic end to the elementary particles really worked to enhance the narrative, really brought it all together, right? Whereas with this, it seems kind of disparate, right? Kind of, separated. And there was an element of Houellebecq just being out of touch. The assistant of the woman hired to train Bruno writes notes on a notepad. For some reason that just hit me as strikingly unbelievable in the year 2027. I don't think Houellebecq is up to date on technology or the internet. And more power to him, you know, but it shows in the book. And the Houellebecqian tropes feel recycled, stale, reheated leftovers from his previous novels, musings on food and blowjobs, a comedic moment of accidental incest with strikingly inconsequential results. Things like this, again, it just feels like it was brought in to fill the pages, you know? I will admit the ending is devastating in a quiet, solemn manner. All of the hospital and medical events in the book seem to have been the most well-researched, and they're believable. Not having personally experienced that end-of-life environment, but having witnessed it, I can say that this is the closest I have seen it realistically portrayed in a novel. I could see where it was going, and it went there. And it was dark, and I was kind of put back into that space again. It was difficult for me to read, which is a testament to its accuracy. That part, he nailed it. For any of you who are curious, that's what it's like. He got all of it. The fate of Aurélien, who was sympathetic and who I liked as a character, and whose predicament I found compelling, for me, was a stretch. I didn't buy it. Even for a character of his fragile disposition, he had too much going for him with Maurice. In spite of Indy and the mistake and all that. I mean, he's not, you know, I suppose it could happen, but for a contemplative guy, it seemed like far too quick a reaction. And it just seemed to be there to raise the stakes of the novel and make things worse. There's a lot I didn't buy, but I bought the ending. So it seemed like it was a portrait of a passive character victimized by the cycles of nature. And maybe that's what most of us are. Fair enough. But the result, when depicted in a novel, was monotonous. This is from the book. Moments happen or don't happen. People's lives are altered and sometimes destroyed by them. And what can one say? What can one do? Apparently nothing. That's essentially the crux of the book. It's a novel of acquiescence. One could criticize it as fatalistic, but then one would have to prove that there's a fate offered to us other than the one presented. And generally speaking, realistically, there isn't. And there was far less humor in this one, or so it seems to me, and that was one of my biggest disappointments with the book. Normally, Houellebecq, even at his darkest, has an ability to deliver horrific truths with a dose of the darkest comedy. In this book, it's fairly barren of attempts to assuage the cold, dark truth it delivers, further adding to the listless tone. Perhaps it's because there are some things that he feels cannot be discussed humorously, and he felt it would be inappropriate. But then I never looked to Houellebecq to be appropriate, you know? Annihilation shows us that even when someone is embroiled in the big, top political events of a nation and culture, when they're right next to it, inside it, maybe not necessarily a part of, but privy to it, all of that just falls away when something goes wrong with one's health. Suddenly, the craziest stuff that's happening in the world is virtually meaningless. Because in fact, for that person, the world is now ending. That's the strong part of Annihilation. The best part of the book was the last quarter or so. It felt like the most researched, the most developed, the part with the most punch. An interesting thing about the book is that even though Paul's marriage seems doomed at the start, it has a renaissance, and their relationship is rebuilt stronger than ever, perhaps in no small part because of the deaths in their families, both of their families, which mirrors the election win due to the horrific terrorist attack on the migrants. Catastrophe, while never hoped for of course, as a character in the book implies regarding the election, when she says she wishes that wasn't the cause of their electoral victory. Catastrophe, horrible as it is, can produce positive events and strengthen bonds. So Houellebecq is telling us another truth, which is that even though relationships can go south, they can be rekindled and brought back stronger than ever, perhaps especially in times of dire urgency. In Paul's case, far from being a disappointing situation while passing into death, Houellebecq actually presents us with something of an ideal, perhaps the best one could hope for given the circumstances, really, in the form of Paul and Prudence's rekindled marriage. You know, it does happen. Marriages are resurrected. It isn't over till it's over, and I thought that was beautiful. But in my opinion, it doesn't rescue the book from being a disappointing series of build-ups that lead to nada. It did occur to me that the novel is playing with the reader's expectations of a novel, and simply stating that, indeed, that's what life is. A series of seemingly important build-ups that lead to nada. That's fine, and it's interesting as a project, but much of the novel is boring. Again, plenty of life is boring, and he's obviously aware of that too. But I don't read novels to mirror the boredom of real life, you know? Neither does Paul the character, as he becomes infatuated with Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes while he's in the hospital, to escape the tedium of life in the hospital while undergoing chemotherapy. I'm quite aware of life's tedium as it is. You are too. You don't need books to learn that. But perhaps the novel is a reinforcement of the truth of what we all face. The confirmation of Houellebecq's experience in life. What he has understood to be the truth. That's legitimate. As a reality, it's tremendously disappointing. But the problem is that, as fiction, it's also tremendously disappointing. It shows us that there is no reconciliation, no transcendence, and that there will never be any closure in spite of all of our hopeful expectations. Hope is the fault of Christianity, as one character describes. That's all legitimate too. It may be true, but it's still a boring book. But if Houellebecq's intentions were as I described, it's a wild success. So what to say? Perhaps in the end there's nothing left to say, and silence speaks louder than words, as portrayed in the story. Now are these just the complaints of a man who is in the prime of his life, who feels, perhaps foolishly, that he's nowhere close to the death portrayed in the book, and would prefer to be entertained with some witty, scandalous truths that could provide him some use? Yeah, sure, fair enough. It's a fair criticism. Perhaps I've just finally been confronted with one of Houellebecq's truths that, for the first time, I simply can't tolerate, which would be the fantastically disappointing nature of life itself. It's not a requisite for the author to entertain us like a dancing clown. But I felt as though Houellebecq has already said what he has in this novel, in others that he's already written, and perhaps better, so there's nothing new. No surprises. So better than food? No, not for me. However, because it's Houellebecq and he's vastly more interesting than all of the authors writing today, it's better than food by default. But compared to his previous works, no. I'm really on the fence with this book, so because of that I've decided to introduce a rating system, a scale of 1 to 5 coffees, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. Annihilation is 3 out of 5 coffees. Not bad, quite good as far as modern novels, but compared with Houellebecq's earlier works, not the best. It has its moments, but I doubt I'll reread it. It seems like he's done with it, you know? Houellebecq, it seems like he's done with writing. And hey, fair enough. He doesn't need to prove he's a genius over and over, we know. He's made his very prominent mark in literary history. He's done it. So you should read it. Well, if you like the writing of J.K. Huysmans, the bleakness of Cormac McCarthy, and the the family breakdown theme of books like Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, yeah, I'd say it's up your alley. And with that, coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all the names of the patrons on Patreon who are supporting the show financially, and I place their names in this mason jar. And whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious. Currently from Brazil. If you would like to support the show and get in on that, I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/books of better than food, and the tiers start at $5 per video. Please set a monthly limit if you're on a budget. Thanks a bunch. In addition, for becoming a paid patron, you'll get access to all this cool stuff. And international shipping is included. Thank you very much to all my patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Harrison S. Thank you very much, Harrison. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive Annihilation by Michel Houellebecq, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly, and I hope you love both. Cheers. Please subscribe if you have not already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and click the bell for notifications to get notified every time I release a video. Very important. And always remember, die reading. Alright, thanks very much for watching. Great to see you as always. Take care of yourselves. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.